This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, debuting in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I'm Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury. Today I am in conversation with my colleague and another host of this show, Washington editor Steve Usdin, talking about this year's topic of back to school, Reimagining FDA. For those who might be newer to BioCentury, Back to School is an annual essay BioCentury's been writing since its foundation over 30 years ago. And this year's package was authored by Steve, one of the foremost experts on FDA, who's been covering drug regulation for over 2 decades, I'm going to say, with an unparalleled level of insight. The topic is always one of central concern to the whole industry and is forward-looking. And I'm saying that because this year's topic, which is about FDA, was actually conceived before this current administration entered and FDA got thrown into more turmoil than ever. But actually, the reality of the regulatory landscape in the United States today, and it reflects what's been going on for a while now, which is most people would argue that FDA is no longer optimally organized for its mission. And that was the case even before this administration entered. So we started out with the idea, if you had a blank piece of paper and could build FDA from scratch, what would it look like? And so, Steve, I want to start by taking a high-level view. I know you have talked and over the years have been in continual contact with thought leaders inside the agency, those who have left the agency, and those who sort of satellite around it and are regulatory experts and legal experts in their own right. Now, your package contains several articles, and what I want to do today is pick out a few nuggets to discuss and then let the audience turn to biocentury.com, for the full package. As I mentioned, there's few people in the industry who would disagree that FDA could use a makeover, and you have a nice history of FDA that explains how to be designed as it is. So let me turn to one of the key themes in the package, which is around restructuring FDA so that the regulation of medical products would be separated out from food, tobacco, cosmetics, and anything else, I suppose. At the same time, you argue that within the Medical Products Agency, the distinctions that we now have between CBER and CEDA and CDRH should be dissolved. So I want you to talk about the reasons behind this restructuring and those proposals and what the pros and cons would be.
So, well, thanks, Simone. And I will modify what you said a little bit, which is that there are an awful lot of people who think, well, actually, we could kind of keep muddling along the way that it was. It wasn't maybe optimal, but all the trouble of changing it's not worth it. There's a lot of people who are, who really think if we just dial the clock back 6 months or so, everything would be fine. I disagree with that. A lot of people I spoke with disagree with that, but that is a prevalent view. So look, starting from kind of foundational principles, one of the things that I point out is that there are historical reasons why we had food, drugs, cosmetics, veterinary products, and tobacco all in the same agency, but it doesn't make sense. If you were starting over again, which I think that we should think about, it would make more sense to have one agency that's focused solely on medical products, and that agency should be as independent as possible, especially independent from political influence as possible. And recent events and events during COVID kind of highlight the importance of having them independent. Then you take the next step and you say, well, right now we have a Center for Biologics, we have a Center for Drugs, we have a Center for Medical Devices. does it really make sense to have separate centers for drugs and biologics? No, it's a mush. There are products that are regulated under BLAs, that are authorized under BLAs, that are part of CDER, the Center for Drugs, and the distinctions between these technologies, are not as important as they once were at all. I also think that there's a good case, maybe not as quickly, maybe not immediately, but over time, for also eliminating the Center for Devices. And so what I really call for is say, well, medical products should be regulated according to the things that matter to patients and that matter to physicians. And honestly, they're the ways that the companies that are developing medicines think about them. And that is largely by the kind of clinical areas, and the model for this is the Oncology Center for Excellence. So what I suggest is that there should be a series of centers that are clinically focused, like the Oncology Center of Excellence, and then they should be supported by centers that have functions that would feed into or support the operations of these different centers. And examples of those would be biostatistics and toxicology, manufacturing technologies, expertise in manufacturing technology. So and one of the advantages of doing that is that it will allow FDA to have really thought leadership in different clinical areas, just like it has thought leadership in oncology. It would have thought leadership in these different areas.
So, Steve, I want to unpack some of this a little bit more slowly. So, you've talked about creating an independent medical products agency. And your point is well taken. Some people think you can roll back the clock. I am interested to some degree in whether people sort of disagree with that idea. But, one thing that you talked about, which is interesting, is that rather than this being under HHS, it should have a commissioner who is independent of that and would have a tenure that is longer than a presidential term. Now, as you point out in Back to School, there's a balance that involves still being accountable to the public. So talk a little bit about how you'd reconcile those and the motivation for needing that kind of independence.
Well, first I'll say that, I'm not the first person by any means to think of that. It goes back a long time. There was a paper that I cite in Back to School that was written
and in fact, there's 7 former commissioners, right?
Exactly.
I think that are on that, right?
By 7 former commissioners who called for FDA to be an independent agency. And the idea of having a commissioner who serves for a fixed term that's longer than a presidential term is to try to get away from this idea that public policy around medicine and medical devices will change with a president, will necessarily change with a new president. And the idea is that there should be a continuity of these ideas. These ideas, the regulation of medical products shouldn't be a partisan issue, and it shouldn't change, and there shouldn't be an assumption of change every time there's a change in presidential administration. And I'd say that had kind of been the idea going back all the way to Mark McClellan in 2002. From Mark McClellan in 2002 to Rob Califf during the Biden administration, there's pretty much been there was a kind of a continuity of thought and policy. There were differences in emphasis, but there was a great deal of continuity in the way that things were thought about.
Let me just drill into this a minute, Steve, because, I think that from a drug developer's point of view, it's very clear why you would want this continuity, and you would want somebody to be independent of political, influence or whichever president is there. From the patient's point of view and patient advocacy point of view, and their need still to have a say in what regulation of drugs should be like, because at the end of the day, this really is for patients. Would that be a benefit to them? Is there a drawback in that way? Can you talk about that?
Well, I think Look, that's where Congress has to come in and play a role. It would have oversight over medical products regulation. And if you go back and look over the years, Congress hasn't been shy about changing FDA's mission, adding to its mission, giving it new authorities, giving it new missions, and things like that. So I don't think that you're going to have a situation where you would have a medical products regulator that wouldn't be accountable politically or wouldn't be accountable to the people. And I have to say one other thing here, which is that I think that when you talk about political interference and political influence on medical products regulation, what I really mean is that the scientific and medical decisions that regulators make shouldn't be influenced by politics, and they certainly shouldn't be influenced by financial considerations. There are bigger policy issues that should be influenced by policy, by political considerations, because they should reflect the needs and the desires of the American people. And there are things that are inevitably going to be contentious. Areas around access to abortion drugs, for example, or the way that the amount of risk tolerance that the agency has, the way that it determines how much risk tolerance it's willing to accept. Those are kind of policy issues that are going to be influenced by the American people, and I think that the way that the American people will express their views on that is through Congress.
And I think that's a great point. I think we should also note, as you do in Back to School, that maybe one of the biggest changes in drug regulation in the last, actually it's a few decades, I should say, in terms of accelerated approval was really brought about by pressure from patient advocacy. So there's certainly many cases in drug regulation where the patient voice has actually translated into regulatory policy.
And that's an example also of the things that have actually caused major inflection points in medical product regulation in the United States have generally been tragedies or crises. Okay, so the AIDS crisis led patients to demand changes in the way that FDA regulated drugs, in particular to demand that it stop requiring overall survival benefits as the only way to get approval of a new drug, and to accept surrogate markers as endpoints for drug development. If FDA hadn't done that, it would have been impossible really to develop new drugs for AIDS. We would still have AIDS, and there would have been millions and millions of people who would have died unnecessarily. There are other, if you go to the history article that I wrote, there are a lot of other crises that have provoked major changes at FDA. And I think that's one of my kind of talking points for selling this idea of making big changes at FDA, is that it really should be possible now to make the kind of changes that are needed to make the FDA capable of supporting the technologies, the science, and the medical needs, and the urgency of the medical needs of the 20th century without waiting for the next crisis to happen.
Right, right. And, before we go to the break, I want to actually talk about something you raised, the Oncology Center of Excellence, OCE, which is an area that has massively benefited from accelerated approval. And the idea that this is a template, you talked about organizing the agency around disease areas or therapeutic areas. And one of the reasons for this is the tremendous advances that have been made in oncology in the last decade. And I want to ask you, to what degree, obviously there's also, it goes in partnership. There's been a lot more money put in oncology than in any other area, and the science has moved quite fast. But to what degree do you ascribe the progress to the regulatory structure and innovation of the Oncology Center of Excellence, headed by Richard Pazder, of course? And to what degree can that translate to other therapeutic areas?
So, look, it's interesting. I speak with Rick Pazder. I've interviewed him many, many times. And, one time I asked him, I said, in the past, people used to call you, the Wall Street Journal editorial page called him Dr. Death, and people were very much against him. And now he's become, a hero, at least in some quarters. And he said, well, look, what happened is that the science changed. But there's more to it than that. And the way that you can see that there's more to it than that is all of the kind of innovative regulatory ideas that have started with the Oncology Center of Excellence. Some of them have spread to other areas of FDA. I would argue that some of the others should spread to other areas of FDA. So an example, Project Orbis, where you have regulatory agencies around the world looking at applications for cancer drugs at the same time and making it possible, at least, to have approvals nearly simultaneously around the world. That's a tremendous benefit for patients. Project Facilitate, which facilitates compassionate use, or what FDA calls expanded access to non-approved drugs for individual patients or even for small groups of patients. That's been tremendously successful, and it's also diffused a lot of tension and controversy around that area. So there are a whole bunch of other examples of regulatory innovation that's happened at the Oncology Center of Excellence, which aren't really tied to oncology. They could have been done at other parts of FDA. And I think that one of the reasons that they didn't is because other parts of FDA weren't organized in the same fashion as the Oncology Center of Excellence. I'd also point out one thing, because I know we do have to go to break, which is that the Oncology Center of Excellence hasn't ever actually fully realized the vision that Rick Pastor had when it was created, and that advocates who wanted it had, because it has authority over oncology drugs that are regulated at CDER, they're regulated as drugs. It doesn't have the same authority over drugs that are regulated as biologics by CBER, though I think...
And let's just articulate, that means the CAR T therapies and, a whole range of different modality therapies, right?
That exactly. So there's a kind of informal collaboration between the Oncology Center of Excellence and CBER, which actually in recent months has become closer, I think, than it had in the past. But it still hasn't really kind of fully realized the vision for that center when it was created.
All right. We will take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to pick up the conversation about Reimagining FDA.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe. Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, will make its European debut in 2025. Join us to debate key translational bottlenecks and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us for the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe in Cambridge, UK, the September 17th to 19th. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandraundseurope.com.
We are back at the BioCentury Show, where I'm in conversation with Steve Usdin about this year's back-to-school topic, Reimagining FDA. Steve, as I noted earlier in this conversation, you had several, like 7 articles in this package?
Yeah.
Yeah, we were busy. And we were busy editing. So there we go. Everybody had a lot of very interesting reading for people. Okay. It really is a great thread that goes through. And there are a few concepts that pick up across the stories, and some of them we got into, but one particular article you have is about a learning agency, right? And earlier, we talked a little bit about how other things could learn from OCE, but in this learning agency story, there's one thing that you raised that I thought was extremely interesting, which is this idea of creating a kind of review structure after things go wrong, similar to what the NTSB does. So tell us a little bit more about that, and if that could ever happen, what it would look like.
Well, that's interesting. So NTSB, that's National Transportation Safety Board. And so what happens if there's an airplane crash, or a train gets derailed, or some other kind of transportation disaster in the United States? There's this independent board that goes in. They have authority to ask all kinds of questions. They have non-political expertise on the board to investigate what happened, and then they make a report. And the idea is that then there can be changes that can be made to prevent the disaster from recurring, right? So my idea is that there are things that happen in drug regulation that are unanticipated, that are unplanned, So some of them are things that harm patients. Some of them are things that make it more difficult to develop drugs. And what happens now? What happens now when you have something like that is that everybody points fingers. FDA tries to sweep it under the rug usually, and they kind of like move on. And there's no learning from it.
And
So
just to clarify, Steve, what are the kinds of incidents that you're talking about when you sort of talk about failures? Is this sort of a drug
well,
withdrawal, or
so
talk a little bit more?
so okay, so for example, for accelerated approval, it's kind of an assumption that's built into it that some drugs are not going to demonstrate clinical efficacy or safety that was anticipated before when they received accelerated approval. And I think a lot of people would say, well, that's okay. If you don't have any failures, then you're probably not taking enough risks. But I think when you do have a failure, when you do find out that FDA granted accelerated approval to something and then it turns out not to have been effective, there should be an investigation afterwards, not to assign blame, but so that FDA and the public can learn from it and drug developers can learn from it to happen again. Then there have been some, very high profile crises over the years. One I remember, for example, was contaminated heparin. They came in the United States. That was a horrific situation. People died, and people were afraid to use a drug that is really a backbone for. FDA eventually did figure out what was happening and how to screen for it and to prevent it, but I'm not sure that there was the right kind of investigation done afterward to ensure that something like that couldn't happen again. And then the kind of like mother of all learnings, really, in recent history has got to be COVID. FDA did some kind of investigation after COVID and after the COVID crisis was over, and came up with lessons learned. But I don't think that anybody is really satisfied that FDA learned everything that it needs to learn from the COVID experience, or that it put in place the things that it needs to do so that it can do a dramatically better job the next time it's presented with a pandemic.
So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour on this one, because you've really tapped into something that is an overarching theme. Again, talked about it a lot at the top, regarding trust and trust in science, which I think goes beyond FDA right now. Got a lot going on right with CDC and vaccines, but we really do need trust in drug development. And so, to what degree do you take that idea, which I think the idea of the review board, NTSB kind of board, might feed into, to give people assurance that these things are being looked at impartially? How feasible is that in this environment and where we are, or where we hope to be, even if we reimagined FDA? And B, is that really just an FDA issue? Is it, if you take FDA out of HHS, is that still consistent with FDA being responsible for engendering trust in its decisions?
It's a key issue. It's not going to be resolved by one particular thing or another thing. It's got to be a whole pattern of activities. And honestly, I think it's going to take a very long time for the American people to regain trust in science, or to regain trust in government institutions that are involved with public health. But it's essential that FDA be part of that. This idea, I think, of having a non-political entity that goes in and investigates controversies, not even necessarily crises, but controversies, and presents reports, I think could be part of an important part of building up that trust. I also think taking the medical products regulation and separating it from food, from tobacco, from cosmetics, from veterinary things, will also help to kind of dial down the political heat around FDA, and it will make it possible for FDA's leadership, or for this medical product agency's leadership, to devote 100% of their time to medical product regulation. Right now, you've got an almost impossible job. You've got commissioner who's expected to, in the same day usually, to have to deal with drugs, to have to deal with tobacco, to have to deal with food, potentially with veterinary issues or cosmetics issues. It's a portfolio that really defies any single individual. So I think that that'll be another part of helping to build up trust in the agency. I think that having visible systems for receiving external advice, scientific advice from the patient community is also another part of building up the trust. And to do that, I think one of the things that has to be done is to reform the FDA advisory committee system, and another is to come up with ways for FDA to receive external advice much earlier in the process. Right now, what I've said about advisory committees is that usually they have the wrong people on them, they're asked the wrong questions, and they're held at the wrong times. But other than that,
And you
great.
pointed out that they kind of end up being more like a sort of legal courtroom drama, right?
That's the way people. That's the way that people view them, and that's really, not what they're intended to be. That's not what they should be. But I think that what's really important is the timing. I think that it's really important for FDA to have far more opportunities to receive advice and input from the scientific community, medical community, and especially from the patient community earlier in drug development, so that there's consensus that's built around the decisions that FDA makes. For example, I think that, well, to take one of the more recent controversies around approvals of drugs for Alzheimer's disease, that would have been very, very different if FDA had a series of workshops over the years looking at Alzheimer's disease and talking about the science and talking about the kind of endpoints that the agency would accept. What would it be that companies would have to demonstrate in order to get approval of a drug in advance? And then it wouldn't.
I think
It shouldn't come as
that's
a surprise.
yeah, I mean, that is a particularly interesting one because we tend now, post facto, to think about the approval of the Aduhelm as a sort of, I don't know if you want to call it a debacle, but a very controversial moment where some people were saying it doesn't work, it shouldn't be approved, and others were saying, put it out there. But actually, the controversy there really, and we'd written about this, Steve, as you know, goes back decades, where it's the general controversy about the amyloid hypothesis. And so you sort of already had believers and non-believers baked in. But, so I think that sort of more debate from a regulatory point of view could have been really interesting. But I want to jump from there in your learning idea and what you talked about to the rest of the world, right? Where not everybody is structured the way FDA is. And one thing that was, for me, one of the most interesting parts of the package is the article on what other regulatory agencies around the world are doing, because we know that FDA has been the gold standard, but that doesn't mean that other agencies aren't innovating in specific areas, right? At a high level, they might not necessarily compete with FDA, but there are certain areas where there are things that FDA could learn from them as well, right? And you might talk about some of them. One that stuck out to me was something that you called the sort of non-sexy thing of manufacturing, where there's a big difference between European regulators and US regulators. In the US system, it's more of a sort of compliance approach, right? Just make sure nothing is wrong. Whereas in Europe, EMA has got like formal structures aimed at improving manufacturing quality. And we know that manufacturing is one of the big issues. It may not be the sexy one, but the big issues that face especially new therapeutic modalities. So can you talk a little bit about that, how you came across that, and sort of any other things from different parts of the world that you'd want to highlight?
Well, so for the manufacturing, there's Europe, and there's also, it's very interesting, Japan, So what the Japanese do, and how I came across this was because I was talking to Janet Woodcock, the former acting FDA commissioner and longtime head of CDER, and asking her about this. And she pointed to Japan and Europe as examples for manufacturing, for things that the United States could learn from. And one of the things that's really interesting about Japan is that they have a whole set of criteria that they have for evaluating the manufacturing quality, that a company's manufacturing quality. and it gives it a grade, A, B, C, D. And the higher the grade, the less frequent and the less intrusive the inspections that it does, because it's trying to focus the inspections on the bad actors are the ones that it thinks are more likely to cause problems. And the interesting thing about that is it creates a kind of virtuous cycle, because companies want to improve their quality, they want to improve their whole quality culture so that they get a higher grade, so that they are more trusted, and they're less likely to have the kind of intrusive inspections and things like that. And in Europe, one of the things that Dr. Woodcock pointed out is the quality of the inspectorate. She said basically that in order to become an inspector in Europe, you have to have years of experience in industry, in manufacturing, so you know where the bodies are, right? You know what can
You
go
know what
wrong.
can go wrong, right?
Yeah, because you've been a part of that, and as a result, the pharmaceutical manufacturing quality in Europe is quite high, especially compared to the United States. And that kind of feeds back into another thing, which I think is really critical. That's really an undercutting issue for everything, which is that medical products regulation depends on the quality and the talent of the people who are at the agencies. And one of the things that's really essential is to have effective systems for recruiting talented people, which means you have to have a workplace that's attractive for talented people. That gets back to this idea of having clinically oriented centers where they're thought leaders,
Right.
having projects like the things that the Oncology Center of Excellence has, that give people a sense of a purpose and recognition. You have to have good systems for training. You have to have retention systems, things that are put in place intentionally that are going to not only bring good people into the agency, but keep them there. And then one final thing I think that's really essential is that now, with the amazing pace of kind of blistering pace of science and technology, it's really critical for a medical product agency to have systems in place to bring new people in, to bring young people in, even if they're not going to be there for a long period of time, just to infuse it, to continually infuse it with knowledge of the new technologies and new science.
So, Steve, we're almost out of time. Some would argue we are, but I'm going to still ask you one more question. I think what you've talked about is really important, and you do write a fair amount about the archaic IT infrastructure, the need to implement AI, advancing digital technologies. All of these are things that the agency must do to be an agency fit for purpose in the incoming era. Now, someone has to pay for that, Steve. And one of your most provocative ideas, perhaps, is to get rid of the user fees, PDUFA. Now, that has actually brought in a lot of money for regulation. And on the one hand, you want to make it separate from Congress or from HHS. And on the other hand, you want Congress and the taxpayer to pay. I'm not against that. I think there's a lot in there, but maybe you need to explain how to Joe and Jane taxpayer, why they should be doing this.
So, well, look, because it's a common good. It's the epitome of a common good, having good drug regulation. And look, what I say is that the user fee system, one, I trace the history of it and point out that at first I think it was like 7% of
That's right.
FDA's drug review budget, and now it's far more than half. It's like, I think that user fees are like, they're like a gas. They expand to fill any container, and that has eroded public trust in the agency, even though people at FDA, people in drug companies, they will all assure you completely that regulatory decisions aren't influenced by user fees. And I believe that. But I don't think you could explain that. I don't think that most people who aren't close to the situation will believe that. Look, if getting back to the National Transportation Safety Board, if when you were getting on an airplane, you found out that the people who were regulating the airplane to determine whether it's safe or not were being paid by the companies that make airplanes, and that they were determining what the speed of the reviews of the planes were going to be, and that they were determining what the features of, and then that was renegotiated periodically with the industry, you might be a little bit more hesitant about getting on that plane, right? And even if people assured you that, of course, it has nothing to do with affecting the quality of the inspections of the planes. I also say, look, the best thing is Congress should just pony up the money, and it's not a lot of money. The budget for the whole budget for the FDA, including everything right now, is smaller than the school system for Montgomery County, Maryland, where the FDA is headquartered. So it's not a great deal of money.
Yeah, there's a very cool graphic that people can look at to see how it is against the other agencies, and even then, only half of that or less is the medical products review, right? So
Yeah.
you're right, yeah.
But okay, but if you say, okay, well, we really can't count on Congress, they are pretty fickle when it comes to allocating money, then what I say basically is, well, look, industries, they're used to paying this money now. They should just pay it in the form of a tax. There should be a tax on approved drugs, and you can have kind of exceptions if there's some kind of drugs where it's a good public policy reason not to have a tax on it, and so on. Because right now it's a tax anyway. I mean, look, the companies are paying these user fees, and the costs of that user fees are getting rolled into the costs of drugs when they're launched. There's no way around it. I just think that it would be better if it wasn't explicitly framed as a user fee, and if you get away from this negotiation between the industry and regulators. Again, people in the industry, people at FDA will say, well, it's a good thing to have those negotiations because you have this periodic reassessment of FDA's performance. You have goals that are associated with it and things like that. I think you can and should have that kind of an ongoing assessment of FDA's performance. FDA should be accountable and should be held accountable, but it should be done in ways that the American people come up with through legislation, through Congress, rather than through a negotiation that happens kind of behind closed doors between industry and the agency.
Thank you, Steve. I want to say it was a pleasure to read and a pleasure to edit this really interesting, huge piece of work, 7 pieces of work to be quite precise. And we obviously will continue to talk and develop these ideas in our coverage. And so I invite our audience to go to biocentury.com and find the full package of Back to School, Reimagining FDA.
Well, and thanks. It was a lot of fun to do it. It's a lot of fun to talk about it. And I should say, I'm sorry, I should have said at the beginning one more thing, which is that I don't claim to have all of the answers here. I actually want to provoke a discussion, and I'm quite willing to accept that any of the particular things that I've said, or maybe all of them, aren't quite right. And it could be done better. And what I would welcome is a dialogue. With people who are listening to this, if they think they've got better ideas,
let us know. Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
All right. Thank you, Steve. Brought to you by the inaugural BioCentury Grand Rounds Europe, debuting in Cambridge, UK this September. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore groundbreaking advancements in early-stage R&D and dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Learn more at biocenturygrandroundseurope.com.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury Show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.